Dann würde ich jetzt unseren Kollegen Steven Leitheiser von der Universität in Groningen zu mir bitten. Steven, what are we going to discuss in our next dialogue in English?
Yes, so our next dialogue is going to be about citizen participation. So what roles can citizens play? What roles are they already playing? And just to sort of see what's already happening on the ground. And for that, we're going to invite on the stage Jessica Duncan, who is Associate Professor in the Politics of Sustainable Food System Transformation at Wageningen University in the Netherlands, and Maarten Crivits, who is a researcher at the Research Institute for Agriculture, Fisheries and Food in Ghent. So welcome, Jessica and Maarten.
Great to be here.
Did I miss anything there in your titles? I got
Perfect.
everything. Okay. All right. So yeah, let's just go ahead and start with the first question that I mentioned. The session is about the role of citizens in the sustainable food system. So maybe Jessica first, what role can citizens play? And maybe more importantly, what role are they already playing?
Wow, huge question. I think citizens are already playing a really diverse number of roles. And I really like that this conference is focusing on citizens rather than consumers or individuals, because citizens comes with this idea of responsibility, and that's an obligation. And this is really important to remember. From my perspective, just to give a bit of context, I study policy. I'm very interested in policy processes, so you might not be surprised to know that I think citizens have a very key role to play in influencing municipal and urban food policy strategies and food policy processes. I think there are also, within that, two very important roles that citizens have to take on. The first is being very concrete as they can, about their visions for the future, their desires, their values, their food cultures. And the second is playing a key role holding governments accountable. We often forget about that second role. We put so much emphasis on, focusing on the policy, getting the right policy, but policy isn't necessarily action. And there's a really important role for, for citizens to play on that second piece, holding governments accountable, continuing to push for the policies and the food futures that they want.
Yeah, and one thing you touched on there is like the difference between citizens and consumers. And I think that's a role that's often blurred. And maybe Maarten, you have researched quite a bit about democratic theory as well. Could you tell us what your understanding of citizenship is, and maybe define what the difference is between a citizen and a consumer?
Well, yes, indeed. We often tend to, when we look at the food system and when we are engaging with the public, there's often still an image of the food consumer. And I think shifting towards another way of thinking, towards food citizenship, and towards really emphasizing the role citizens can take up, an active role they can take up in the food system. This really is like a shift in perception as well. I think that there's still a kind of persistence of our self-image as a consumer, and that this cannot be underestimated in terms of the role that citizens play. There's even been this research that I've been looking into, where they did a kind of dilemma, like an experiment, where they posed a collective problem, and what came out of the experiment was that when people were primed with the word as such consumer, that they tended to have more individual behavior. So I think that merely when we reduce our agency to only thinking in terms of buying and selling, which is what we associate with being a consumer, then we miss out on a lot of potential active engagement of citizens. And I think that role of citizens, in that sense, needs to be activated. And cities can play a role in that by looking at what is already happening in their city. But I think they also can play a role by engaging with citizens. For instance, if a city has a local food strategy, to communicate that local food strategy and to put some agency, to put some responsibility, to put some effort into having a dialogue with residents in order for them to become thinking in terms of citizens rather than consumers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Maarten. And Jessica, do you have some thoughts on that as well, about how we should think about citizens?
Yeah, well, I just wanted to follow up because I think Maarten's point about how we've sort of trained ourselves to think of ourselves as consumers and the kind of language that we hear in many of these food policy processes really reinforces that. So we're often taught to, for example, vote with our forks. And that sounds so compelling because it kind of brings in this idea of citizenship. But what it's actually positioning us as people who can afford to buy stuff. It's still a consumer narrative, and that really starts to erase really important questions around income and power. I think the second thing that we tend to do is also talk about, but if people just have enough education, they'll become better citizens. And I also am all in favor of more food systems education, but it's such a tricky thing to say. I hold a PhD in food policy. I work at one of the top universities working on food in the world, and I stand in the grocery aisle overwhelmed with trying to make the right decisions. So I think in focusing on the citizen, I don't think we should lose sight of the importance of focusing also on these structural issues that provide improved structures for decision making for citizens. And the third and last point, if I may, is there are also important gender dynamics here. When we talk about improving the food system, when we talk about being better citizens, a lot of that actual work, a lot of that practice falls on women. And so I think we also need to be quite concerned, or at least aware, what we're asking for when we ask for, more local food to be bought and produced and consumed and prepared. Who does that work? Well, it would be great if it was more equal. So there's sort of that dynamic. But I think too often we talk about, the going back to this beautiful mealtime and living our values, and that doesn't happen outside of the kinds of social structures that we live in. So being aware of that is key.
Yeah, not everybody has the time and the resources for that.
No.
Yeah, that brings us to our next question, which is looking at this distinction between different types of participation. So on the one hand, there's what's called invited spaces of participation. This is a participatory process which the government sort of shapes, or you could also consider being a consumer as an invited space of participation. And to contrast that with invented spaces of participation is more like the things we're seeing in food policy councils or in community-supported agriculture, where citizens are innovating and designing their own contributions, making an active or taking an active role in shaping the food system they want to see. So how can we better recognize invented spaces and maybe integrate them more into urban food governance?
Maarten?
Yes.
Well,
I really like your question about the relationship between invited spaces and invented spaces. And so there is, depending on the political structure in the city, there's a different relationship between those two spaces. And maybe I would just like to give one example where you have citizens becoming more aware of what is happening in their city. And in a sense, what they do is they make themselves invited. So in a sense, they knock on the door of the policymakers and they say, hey, we are concerned with a public issue. And for instance, in the city of Ghent, where I'm also a resident, I have been also as a researcher into the topic of public lands, but also as a citizen. So I'm taking this double role of researcher and citizen. And as a citizen collective, we have there was a collective concern that a lot of public lands that were owned by the city were sold. So they were sold in the private market, and in a short amount of time, about 1,500 hectares of the 3,000 hectares that the city has in the past acquired or been given has been sold. So these citizens, they concerned this as a problem, and they said, wait a minute, city, please take some time to reflect on what you can do, because you also have a local food strategy, and maybe you can use those public lands in order for local farmers to produce for the city, to set up an economically viable community support agriculture, where links are being made with the social function that because the land is owned by by the social service department. So, but as a consequence, what this collective of citizens did, they wrote an open letter, and it was signed by more than 600 residents. There were a lot of organizations that signed, and this led to a reaction. It signaled something to the city. The media picked it up. Political parties also engaged, both that were in the coalition as well as in the opposition, and it became a topic. And as a result, there is now some opening towards a land policy in the city, where where there is a 2-year process to make a vision. So hopefully this could lead towards a real politically legitimate document. But if I think the citizen collectives wouldn't have knocked on the door, they would not also, the topic of public lands would also not have been invited or welcome in the political structure, to say so, of the city, or in the city council, for instance.
Yeah, that's an important point. I think one way I've talked about that is that citizens sometimes need to become sparring partners with their governments instead of spectators, and kind of really demand that more active role. And maybe that brings us to some more of something that Jessica has worked on before, which is sort of how conflict and disagreement play a role in policy, and maybe how this can even be a productive thing. So Jessica, maybe could you talk about conflict in policy and participation and how that can be productive?
Yeah, absolutely. I've been studying this at the local level more recently, but done most of my fieldwork at the global level. And what we've noticed is that when you can create autonomous civil society mechanisms or autonomous networks of citizens who are respected by the formal policy body, so the sort of invited space and the created space, or what did you call it, invented space, are recognize each other as sparring partners. I like that term a lot. I would call them sort of opponents, like in a chess match. When they recognize the legitimacy of one another, you can actually create space for disagreement and conflict. And if you have the mechanisms in place, then that disagreement allows you to kind of open up conversations that allow us to move beyond the low-hanging fruit, because this becomes a very difficult tension when we come to citizen organizations involved in policy making. Citizens have the benefit of being able to think big and push for values and push for very normative ideas. Governments also have that opportunity, but there's a number of constraints that include budgets and policy agendas and various things that they have to manage. And what tends to happen in policymaking processes around things as value-laden as our food system is that we go for what we can agree on. And that's why we see a lot of vote with your fork campaigns and a lot of educate the youth campaigns, which are so valuable and important, but limited for the reasons I already said. And when you open up space for debate or dialogue or sparring, you open up space to identify what the tensions are, and then you can start to push forward on the more contentious issues. And if you create mechanisms like we've seen at the global level, for example, through the Committee on World Food Security, where you identify very clearly quotas and constituencies to ensure that people are represented in important ways, and you prioritize particular voices of those who will be most affected by the policy processes, and you understand that this will not be efficient, this will be messy, it's not necessarily personal, but you get if we get over this idea that policymaking is efficient rather than democratic debate, then we can really start to open up and identify values. And that also helps to mention trade-offs and come to sort of more transparent understanding of what's at stake when we make policy for food systems.
Yeah, great. I think you made a lot of really good points there. And that conscious recognition of maybe different constituencies or different stakeholders, that's a really important thing going forward. And then that also brings us to our next question, which is something we already mentioned earlier, is that not everybody has capacities or resources that enable active participation. So really at a municipality level, or at an urban level, what conditions could enable more inclusion, and how could participation become more inviting to all people? Maarten, why don't you give us your thoughts on that first?
Yeah, well, I think municipalities and their policies play a huge role in this. Are they aware of the different voices in their city, and do they have the procedures in order to be aware? And I think often this reflection does not happen, I think, within the municipality. But there are some instruments, political instruments, deliberative instruments that are gaining traction, that are becoming more popular, that I think would be very useful to consider also in this forum. And I would like to just give one example, also relating the example to how we can invite all voices at the table. And that's the example of the participatory budgeting. So participatory budgeting, there you want to, as a city, as a municipality, you have some budget that you give towards your citizens to engage local communities, to organize local sustainable projects. Often what you see is that this is a learning process. If cities use this tool of participatory budgeting, I'd like to give the example again of the city where I live. There has been a first round of participatory budgeting. About more than €1 million has been invested. About 17 proposals were granted. But one key lesson that they learned when they evaluated these citizen projects is that there was a lack of, or there was a difficulty, a struggle of the citizens themselves in order to make a connection with other social groups or with vulnerable groups. And in the second round that is going on now, they are doing a kind of experiment where they work with a kind of neighborhood panels. So the proposals are on the neighborhood level or on the neighborhood level, and they have invited 20 people that are representative of all the communities and all the backgrounds in the neighborhood, and they are guiding the citizens into how can we make a connection better with, for instance, people from a different religious background, people from a different cultural background, different people who are living in a different world, basically. And this is like a very, I think, smart way to try to make citizens self-aware of how they can make a bridge across social groups and backgrounds. So yeah, these instruments I think are important, and making them more inclusive is a challenge.
Yep, for sure. And we just have a couple minutes left, but maybe Jessica, do you want to give some last thoughts on that question too?
Yeah, I'd love to, because I think this point that Maarten raised in the example is excellent. Although it does tap into a debate that's happening again at the global level right now about how we get all voices at the table and if we actually want all voices at the table. I think another part of community organizing is exclusion, that we can't have everybody at the table. And when we look at the academic literature, there's this idea of the all effective principle, so everybody should be around the table, or the most effective principle, which prioritizes through concrete categories and quotas the particular kinds of actors or representatives of community groups that should be at the table to ensure that there's not an overrepresentation of particular voices. Because we do know that one of the challenges of current food policy processes is they tend to attract a certain kind of person. They look a lot like myself. So looking and challenging the all effective principle with the idea of the most effective principle, and that involves mapping and working and trusting communities, could be a neat step forward to sort of answer the second part of Maarten's point.
Okay, yes, lots of important stuff there to break down, and hopefully we can get back to some of those points in the workshops in the afternoon. But for now, I think we have to go back to Christine, and we will go to the next.
Yeah, and I would like to ask the audience to get all the questions and come back later for the Q&A session after 11:45 in room 3. If you want to meet Jessica and Maarten, they will be around and have like 45 minutes to answer all your questions. Thanks for being here, Jessica and Maarten. And I see you later in the afternoon also in the pitching workshops. And I would like to thank my colleague, Stephen. Stephen, I see you later on